Shall we play a game?
So this movie, as Geoff said, did very well. Caused Toho to decide in 2016 to start this movie up again with Shin Godzilla, Shin, Shin Godzilla. So I'll run through this one fairly quickly because but there is some really good nuke stuff in here. This was a Toho Studios. It was a completely rebooted film. It was inspired in part by the 2011 nuclear accident at the Fukushima nuclear power plant and the massive earthquake that preceded that. It's the first Toho movie in 12 years and the first in 20 years to not have another monster other than Gojira in the movie itself. The movie starts with something astray in the Tokyo Bay as the water floods into the Aqua Line, which is kind of a subway system or a car tunnel. Panic ensues. The Japanese prime minister and the government have lots and lots of meetings. About 90% of this movie are boardroom meetings, task forces, government staffers brainstorming ideas. I really think that the true villain of this movie is meetings.
Did you notice one of my favorite things about this movie is that the titles of the people keep changing throughout the different movie, throughout the movie. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's definitely a response to the fact that the Japanese government didn't handle Fukushima well.
Oh, absolutely.
And then it's super unorganized and everyone's doing too many things. And so you'll have the same characters that continue popping up on the screen, but every time you see them, they've got a different title. Right. And it's like growing and they have more responsibilities.
Yeah. So I love, like you're saying, the titles keep getting longer. Yeah. So it's like the one guy who is able to do anything. Hold on one second while I find this. He's Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary Rando Yaguchi, and then he eventually becomes Deputy Chief for Task Force, whatever, and it just gets longer and longer, and then it's Chief Deputy, it just keeps getting bigger, and he gets more and more acronyms and stuff attached to his name, because he's the one guy who's, given charge to actually act amidst all of the red tape.
Well, I think he's one of the people who suggests maybe this is a giant sea creature causing the problem. And they all go, no, it absolutely can't be that. That's silly. And then, of course, immediately, a giant sea creature shows up. I think it's so funny that what it first looks like is so goofy and silly. It looks like a googly-eyed version of those Chinese New Year Street Festival dragons. Yeah. And it's silly, kind of like waddles around and is destroying things more just by accident. That it becomes on to see. It looks completely uncoordinated. But eventually it stands up and looks much more like the original Godzilla. Like, Rachel, as a Godzilla connoisseur, would you say the design for this one is closer to the original?
Yeah, definitely. He's definitely gross. There's a difference.
No, he's disgusting in this movie.
The American monsters are
noble.
He's a different color in this one too, right? The only thing that's really different. He's kind of like a reddish.
Yeah, he's got red. And he's got the thing that really gets me about this Godzilla is his smile goes all the way to the back of his head, and he's got teeth everywhere.
It looks a bit like a Joker character.
You're instantly creeped out when you look at him. He looks like the kind of monster that kids, I think, are scared of. Being in their closet or under their bed. Whereas,
now I will.
Yeah.
I don't want that in my head.
Sorry.
So the government debates about whether or not the self-defense force is able to be used, since they're not technically under attack by another government equivalent force. I love that. They have to have like this debate about, can we actually deploy the military? We're not under attack by what our Constitution allows us to be able to do that. I thought that was super interesting. But the U.S. military is only technically allowed to help in support of the SDF. It can't support first. So they're really stuck, and they can't do anything.
Right. And this is like direct response to Japanese bureaucracy, right? It's like they move from one board meeting and then like, let's resume in new working group board meetings. Yeah. You know, they just keep like shuffling through different conference rooms. And it's meanwhile people are dying, right? The whole point is that the government is unable to deal with the actualities on the ground. They're caught up in process and bureaucracy, and well, if this doesn't work, who's going to take the blame for it? You know, like it's like, who's the scapegoat for this accident? You know, and it's all about personal politicking versus actually saving Japanese citizens, and which is direct corollary to Fukushima, right?
Right. And fortunately, the heroes of the movie, the U.S. Department of Energy, they step up. They give a code name to the creature. They call it Godzilla, which I think apparently they think means God incarnate. I don't know if Rick Perry came up with that one. The origin story of this Godzilla, they kind of hint at it. They say it's unregulated dumping of radioactive materials 60 years ago. Godzilla, or Gojira, ate them. He's an ancient undersea creature. He was mutated by the radiation, and he's emitting some kind of gamma radiation, which is one of the worst kinds of radiation for the human body and for everything, really. But it's unknown to science. It's an element that we don't really know. But they do throw a little bit more flavor. They say Godzilla has fins, and the fins on the back of his body, which look like the fins on a dinosaur, like a stegosaurus, they are heat fins that need to cool Godzilla's internal nuclear reactor. Because what ends up happening is that's why he ends up going into the water, is to cool the fins. I don't know if his heart is made of graphite, but he grows really large and he keeps destroying things. He's on his way to Tokyo. They try to attack and nothing really works. Nothing works. They order an evacuation. Weapons do nothing. The U.S. military is called in, and this is where it gets really interesting. We bring a squadron of stealth B-2 Spirit bombers, which is really good because I didn't know Godzilla had a radar or why you would want to use these. But the U.S. Air Force drops a massive ordnance penetrator, an MOP, and this is actually a really cool scene. It breaks through Godzilla's skin, and then it's bleeding, and it looks like they can destroy it. But then Godzilla, turns out, has these new powers. He basically has missile defense on his back, and it starts shooting lasers everywhere. He destroys the Prime Minister's helicopter. He shoots lasers out of his mouth that destroys all of the B-2s. Nothing can get close to it, but it's clearly overheating, and he ends up just freezing in the center of Tokyo. I believe it's near Tokyo Station. So he kind of just takes a nap and stops there. And there's radiation everywhere. There's chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear teams coming in. They're deployed, and they explicitly make mention of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the film to the type of damage that's there. And I think the final thing I'll say here before I stop is the agriculture minister is the next one down the line of succession, and he's in charge. And at that point, he's more concerned about the sogginess of his lunch noodles than he is about what to do about Godzilla. But he eventually becomes a better character later on. So what do you all think about in the pantheon of Godzilla attack scenes? This one I did not expect him to start shooting lasers around, but it was kind of interesting. I
thought he was pretty cool. I thought he was a pretty cool monster. I thought the bleeding scene, I was shocked that started happening. I wasn't expecting it at all. None of the other monsters have ever been penetrable, I guess. It was really interesting that they decided to make that kind of a facet of this Godzilla. And then that he was able to quickly react to that experience and turn around with these lasers I think it was one of the better scenes in the franchise, honestly. I
didn't expect a scene like that, especially, they hurt him enough that the MOP went into his skin and exploded, and he was not happy about that. If you would have been able to get 2 or 3 more of those in there, he could have gone down before he decided to show his new superpower.
I also think, too, that it's really interesting that this is a Japanese-made film, and the saviors kind of end up being the United States government. I don't know. I know you're going to get into this more in a minute about, some of the other external forces, i.e. the United Nations, which is really weird.
Yeah.
But I just think that this was a really interesting Japanese film because it was so political in its own way, but it was so easy on the United States. I thought that was really interesting, and a really interesting maybe microcosm of the relationship between Japan and the U.S., how our policy relationship and diplomatic relationship has changed from the original 1954, the time that the environment that movie existed in, to the environment that this movie existed in. It seems to me like the creators of this Godzilla movie were much more careful about the way that they portrayed the United States involvement in this issue.
Well, we get introduced to an American character whose grandmother was originally from Japan. She's a American envoy. She's a daughter of a senator. My grandmother was from Japan. Her name is Kyoko Patterson. They keep referring to her as Mrs. Patterson. And she's like an all-purpose government envoy. She almost looks like CIA in the way that they describe her. Very ambitious. She becomes very close friends with Rando Yaguchi, who now he got promoted to head up a task force to come up with some kind of a weapon. They put their brains together, and they basically determine 2 things, right? They determine, 1, that they have an idea of a weapon that they'll use. It's not an oxygen destroyer, but it's some kind of coagulant that will freeze Godzilla's blood. And that's what they try to create. And then they also track down this scientist who is, I think, a Japanese scientist whose wife died because of radiation, and he had been tracking Godzilla and had a bunch of like files about Godzilla. So those two things kind of brought together. Although I would say that I agree with you that they're very careful with the U.S., but the U.S. in the movie is the ones who now decide that they would rather, including the United Nations, they'd rather use a nuclear weapon against Godzilla. That, sure, it's going to destroy Tokyo, but it means it won't come to the United States. Yeah. So I almost thought that the United States, they're not a villain as much as they are a force that needs to be reckoned with. Clearly, Godzilla is the problem in this movie. He is a villain. But the plan is to use a B-83 warhead on Tokyo, which they say is 75 times stronger than the bomb dropped in Hiroshima, which is actually pretty close. It's 80, but it's pretty damn close. And the Prime Minister agrees to this plan. Although they do say that the B-83 is going to be a missile
instead of airdropped. Yeah,
instead of airdropped, which is what the B means. It's a bomb. It's not a W, which is a warhead.
Right. So the B-83 is the last megaton nuclear bomb that we have in the arsenal. Thing that I think is interesting about this is that the United States says we are going to nuke Tokyo, right, under the auspices of the UN. Right. We're going to nuke Tokyo in order to save the rest of the world. Screw, the capital city of Japan.
Japan must not have been on the Security Council at this point.
But the Japanese agree with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which I think is this interesting, like you're talking about, like interesting connections between Japan and the United States. This is like an interesting undercurrent that happens through a lot of these movies, even in the original, where the Japanese have to tiptoe around American involvement or American policy, right?
And also the United Nations, which I thought was so interesting. It means that Japan is really against the world in this circumstance. Mm-hmm. The rest of the movie is a montage of scenes to try to get the coagulant plan ready to go. And I love this. They work with the French to delay at the United Nations the nuclear strike, just to give them a couple little bit of time. So then the final climactic scene I thought was pretty great. It's a series of attacks where they try to distract Godzilla because now he's starting to wake up. They distract Godzilla with train bombs. I love the train bombs. It's like Japanese railways with conventional explosives, just enough to confuse Godzilla for a second so that the U.S. bombers can come in, and then they knock Godzilla over, and then they use like a crane, like what you would use, like kind of like a fire engine that would spray water, but instead it sprays this coagulant into Godzilla's mouth. They do that a couple times, and it works. Yeah. But then you have this giant frozen Godzilla that's standing over Tokyo, which I thought was a great metaphor to end the movie. And they say, essentially the last shot is saying, Yaguchi says Japan will rise again from the ashes as Gojira stands like a monument, and if he moves again, the nukes will be used.
Yeah, right, this threat hanging over them. But also you're forgetting the very last shot is of these weird humanoid Godzillas coming out of his tail.
Yeah, on his tail.
Right? Yeah.
So it's almost like a shade to the end of the 1998 movie, where they're like, oh, baby Godzillas in Madison Square Garden, the eggs are still there.
Yeah, it was really weird. I don't know how to react to the final scene, but I love I like that. That final line really reminded me of the final line from the original Godzilla, right?
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
A couple little things I want to note here: the fact that it's a radioactive waste and not nuclear testing. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It definitely updates it for post Fukushima. They say about how Godzilla's radiation is special, so it actually its half-life is so fast that it's really dangerous at the beginning. Like a shorter half-life means very dangerous, but then eventually it goes away. And they say after 2 to 3 years, we can rebuild Tokyo. Right. So it's kind of like a weird like Deus Ex Machina, but also very dangerous at first. I thought that was a unique thing that I haven't seen in other Godzilla movies.
The other thing that I want to point out that I was reading about this morning that I didn't put together the first time I watched the movie is that weird googly-eyed larva Godzilla from the beginning. It's not just him randomly running amok through the streets out of the water. It's also that he's pushing this bow wave of boats and debris and stuff in front of him. And that and the aftermath of it is very emblematic of post-tsunami.
Yeah.
And so all the debris that was left behind in these townships and cities, and even one of the characters is standing in front of it, sort of shocked by the devastation. Mm-hmm. And so it's very, very cut from the headlines sort of visual representation there.
It's like how so many superhero movies like to basically repurpose 9/11 imagery of smoke and people and buildings collapsing and things. This movie is a very similar parallel to, the large tsunami in 2011. And the last little thing I want to say before we move on to the final movie is that I'm really getting some HBO's Chernobyl vibes in this movie. A lot of the fact that basically the third act of where you have different scenes of scientists and politicians dissolving whatever the disaster is. Lots of introspective discussions about whether or not men as monsters, what is the worst villain, what we are doing in the fight of the United States and UN versus Japan. I don't know. It would fit right in with the HBO series. It's not a perfect parallel. I was watching it and I was like, oh, I'm getting a lot of those kinds of vibes when I'm watching it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, what is the power of human science in order to solve problems, and what are the failings, right? Our inability to meet these tremendous problems that face us today. And I think that's very, very sort of real, like in this larger conversation, and especially this next movie we're going to get into about all of the things that threaten humanity that we haven't yet been able to solve despite all of our technological prowess in science, right?
Absolutely, which is really good for the transition to the next movie because the nukes become a solution again in this film.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play.